Good morning, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland again, and in this video I'm going to continue my introduction to the Northern Ireland Troubles. So we know the Troubles broke out in 1969, really August, but there have been a few incidents beforehand. In 1966, the Republic of Ireland had celebrated the Golden Jubilee of the Easter Rising. That was in 1916, when the whole of Ireland was part of the UK. The IRA, as they started to call themselves, launched a rebellion in Dublin, which was defeated in a week. But anyway, so that really heightened nationalist sentiment. And some Loyalists in Northern Ireland became worried about this. Loyalists are Protestants who are ardent in wanting to remain part of the United Kingdom and won't accept any compromise on that. So some of them formed an organisation called the UVF, Ulster Volunteer Force. They were reusing a name of an organisation which had existed between 1913 and about 1920. So there isn't really a connection between the two UVFs. The second UVF and the first UVF had no members in common. But anyway, the UVF, founded in 1966, was an illegal terrorist organisation, and that year it started killing Catholic civilians. Only killed 2 Catholic men at the time. But planned to kill more. So the UVF seemed to draw no distinction between those who are members of the IRA and Catholics in general. Incidentally, I should point out what the IRA is. Irish Republican Army, founded in 1913 in Dublin. It's properly called the Irish Volunteers, but almost universally known as the IRA. So they wanted the whole of Ireland to leave the United Kingdom and become a republic, so to completely separate from Great Britain. Break the connection with England is a slogan they used from an 18th century Irish revolutionary. Anyway, so the IRA was holding demonstrations in 1966 of men in army uniform. The IRA was illegal as well. So we know, anyway, 1968, there were lots of protests by people who were nationalists, and indeed a few unionists were sympathetic to this cause. It was the Northern Ireland Labour Party. Now, they're called Northern Ireland Labour Party because they're not part of the British Labour Party or indeed the Irish Labour Party. So the Northern Ireland Labour Party wanted Northern Ireland to remain part of the UK, but they didn't feel impelled to make a song and a dance about it. Whereas Ulster Unionists would often fly the British flag on their platform at a rally, sing God Save the Queen. Northern Ireland Labour Party wouldn't do that. Mainly, they say we're about social justice, a better deal for the working class. So a Northern Ireland Labour Party MP, Ivan Cooper, he was strongly involved in the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association. Perhaps I should have mentioned this before. The Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, I'll invent the acronym NICRA for it, was founded in 1965, and it said there is sectarian discrimination, we've got to put this right, and John Hume, who I mentioned in the previous video, was a luminary of it. So they tended to call themselves Civil Rights Association, not use the Northern Ireland bit so much. So they claim not to be unionists or nationalists. In reality, most people in it were nationalists, and therefore in most cases Catholics. And they said the unionist government can rely on the votes of most of the Protestant population. There seemed to be a lot of pork barrel politics going on. The Unionist Party making sure that working class Protestants were going to get council housing sooner than their Catholic counterparts, even if their Catholic families' need was greater because they had more children and more likely to get government jobs and so forth. And that's also because Protestants tended to identify with the state, call themselves British and vote for the Unionist Party and so on, whereas Catholic people often want to join the Republic of Ireland, as of course is everybody's right. But the Unionist government didn't entirely trust the Catholic population, and the Catholic community had a higher birth rate. So since Northern Ireland's foundation as a distinct unit in 1921, people have been saying the Catholic community will one day grow larger than the Protestant community and vote to join the Republic of Ireland. That could happen, quite close to it now. Anyway, so some Loyalists took exception to what the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association was doing and said, oh, they're anarchists. Queen's University at Belfast, some of the radical-minded students were involved in NICRA. Bernadette Devlin was one of them. So she had her own political party, People's Democracy. She won an election in her own constituency. It's in Tyrone. I think it's called Mid-Ulster. So she was a Trotskyite, it seemed to be. So although she was a nationalist, perhaps better to call her a Republican really, in some ways she was very different from the average nationalist politician, who tended to be older men who in some respects was small c conservative, were into traditional Catholic values, whereas this woman was a firebrand radical. So she was the youngest member of Parliament in the British Parliament at the time, baby of the house. The Ulster Unionist Party were worried by all these ructions. There seemed to be rising tension. O'Neill's reform policy had led to disorder on the streets. The RUC was run ragged, trying to control all these demonstrations. There were clashes between Loyalists and the NICRA. Usually it was Loyalist youths attacking NICRA. Now Derry is the second largest city in Northern Ireland. It's crucial in Irish history because of the siege of Derry in 1688 to 89. Won't go into that. But anyway, there's a Protestant-only organisation called the Apprentice Boys of Derry, and they parade around every year. I'm just trying to think when it is. I think it's the 12th of August for the relief of Derry. But anyway, some nationalists and Republicans objected to that, said it's Protestant supremacists and so forth, but they were always allowed to parade in the city centre. Northern Ireland's Home Affairs Minister, William Craig, he refused to let NICRA parade there, but he would permit the Apprentice Boys to parade there, who'd been doing so for well over a century by that time. So there were clashes then, and NICRA held some illegal protests. The RUC were heavy-handed, and they hit some NICRA leaders on the head with batons. The Republic of Ireland's television channel, RTE, filmed some of this, and people were horrified to see bleeding scalps because the RUC had weighed in with excessive force. So some loyalists started to say, O'Neill must go. That's the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, must be got rid of. So remember, he's Prime Minister of Northern Ireland. Above him is the Prime Minister of the whole of the United Kingdom. At that time it was Harold Wilson, a Labour man. And O'Neill was being outflanked by Ian Paisley and his Protestant Unionist Party, as it was then called. Remember the Reverend Ian Paisley, who was a rabble-rouser, who said there must be no compromise with nationalism, who said, well, there is no discrimination against Catholics, and if they're poor, they do it to themselves, and they'd be willing to live in a hovel so long as it's beside a mass house, meaning a Catholic church. So using a derogatory term and saying that papists were terribly dangerous. So he frightened many average Unionists who might have been amenable to compromise into thinking that any concessions to nationalist or Catholic opinion would be the beginning of the end. So there were mutterings in O'Neill's party that they were losing support to Paisley's party and that a new conflict might erupt. The UVF started setting off bombs, which they then blamed on the IRA, including at Silent Valley, took out a reservoir and briefly cut off Belfast from water. Eventually, in 1969, O'Neill stood down as Prime Minister after 6 years. And in his memoirs, he writes "blown from office." That's the title of that chapter, as in the UVF bombs are what forced him out, because, of course, those bombs were pinned on the IRA. They didn't actually kill anyone. They weren't intended to, they did damage. So the bog side of Derry is west of the Foyle and outside the Diamond. The Diamond's the ancient walled city. And that's almost entirely Catholic area, working class community. And there have been clashes with the RUC, and the Bogside had effectively seceded from the United Kingdom in the latter half of 1969, putting up barricades so the RUC and their vehicles couldn't come through. The RUC were not accepted by many people in the Bogside. So despite having more or less left the UK, in effect, the Bogside hadn't actually joined the Republic of Ireland, and people tried to set up their own patrols to maintain law and order. So the IRA was somewhat active there, but people didn't think there would be outright conflict. And middle-of-the-road nationalists seemed to think this was a better situation because they largely distrusted the RUC and they saw them as being just hired to uphold unionism rather than to administer law and order in a even-handed fashion. The Home Secretary at the time was James Callaghan, no relation. And he visited the Bogside, went through the barricades. He brought one detective with him. It was astonishing to think that a top UK politician could do that in complete safety, and not a finger was laid on him. a couple of years later, it would be more than his life was worth to spend a minute in there. So he listened to people's concerns, and he said he would try to improve the situation for them, and that was that. It was all kind of quite vague. They'd stolen some city council buses and used those to build barricades. Well, anyway, August 1969 is when the bogside really erupted, and really much of Northern Ireland. Sorry, I should have mentioned, in January 1969, there'd been a legal march by NICRA from Belfast to Derry. At Burntollet Bridge, they'd been ambushed by a couple of hundred Loyalist thugs who'd been throwing things at them. Nobody was killed, but some people were injured. And the B Specials had been there and hadn't intervened to save the NICRA marchers. A few of the Loyalist thugs who'd attacked NICRA had turned out to be off-duty members of the B Specials. You will sometimes hear myth-making saying that they were all B Specials, or most of them, which is not true. But anyway, it's obviously disgraceful. No police officer, including a part-timer, should be involved in violent disorder. So sorry, back to August 1969, and Loyalists, particularly in Belfast, were attacking Catholic majority districts and burning people's houses, and indeed Northern Ireland was not as polarised as was to later become. In Protestant areas, including working class areas, there would be a few Catholic families and vice versa. So if somebody was living in an area in which there were the religious minority, they were usually subject to intimidation this time and compelled to move. That's all for the moment.